And so, yes. And so, and radio. But what is it about television? Why the concern about television?
Why the concern about why it's being regulated?
No, why would the government want to regulate television more? What concern do they have?
Children can just turn it on.
Do it for the children. These are do it for the children laws. And it's all about, we don't want the kinder to see porn or to see excessive violence or that sort of thing. And so we can say over air broadcast. You see, y'all didn't grow up in an age of over air broadcast. You've always had cable, but over the air broadcast. What is over? What do I mean by over the air broadcast? Does anyone not have cable?
I didn't grow up, but now I do. And it's like a whole new world.
We are so spoiled. So everybody grew up with cable with a gazillion channels, but it used to be that you'd only have 4 channels: ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS. That's pretty much it. Everybody got the same channels. Everybody had the rabbit ear antenna on their TV. Why do you have to have rabbit ear antenna? To pick up the signal. And where does the signal come from? Towers, which beam it out into the air, right? So over the air broadcast, and as you said, because it's everywhere. If you set up a big tower and you're shooting out that television signal, it's everywhere. And so we say that, for one thing, it's uniquely pervasive. It's uniquely pervasive is one of the issues. And we'll see that that'll be even more important when we talk about pornography. The other thing is this. Tell me, who's a techie type person? Tell me in a technical way, how does that beam, what is it? What is the beam? What is the television beam or the signal? It's traveling on electromagnetic waves. It's traveling on the electromagnetic spectrum. And a spectrum is finite. All right? The whole reason that the government, cast your mind back to the early days. Cast your mind back actually all the way to 1927. Radio is new. The build out of radio starts in 1927. But here's the problem. If you start a radio station and you start a radio station and you start trying to use the same place on the spectrum, you're just going to interfere with each other. And so that's what happened. People were starting radio stations all over the country and they were walking all over each other. Right? And there was just interference and it was just a big mess. So the radio companies actually wanted the government to start regulating broadcasts because somebody needed to manage the electromagnetic spectrum. Somebody needed to manage the electromagnetic spectrum so that it would be orderly. And that's a chief job that the FCC still does today. Right? That's one of its core functions. All you people, who's heard of these things called cell phones? That would be a big mess if the government did not stage manage all of the electromagnetic spectrum, because all the companies want more and more space on the airwaves. Right? So we have this long history since 1927 of the government regulating over-the-air broadcasts. This is both TV and radio. And radio. TV and radio. And the case that we can then cite, we can just call it the Red Lion case. An extremely important case, still important today. This is the case that justifies the lowest level of protection for broadcast, and it rationalizes government regulation of over-the-air broadcast. So we said one of the reasons is that it's uniquely pervasive. But they came up with really two big rationales. And these are important. The scarcity rationale and the trustee rationale. The scarcity rationale and the trustee rationale. Just think, use your gut instinct and use your brain. What do you think they mean by scarcity justifies the government regulating broadcast?
There's like not enough, so like you were saying, not enough airwaves or that they're getting jammed, so the government has to regulate it.
Exactly. There's just not enough. There's not enough to go around. Right? It's a finite resource. There are only so many points on that electromagnetic spectrum. And there's just not enough to go around. That's why everybody today talks about the FCC. The big topic right now is the spectrum crunch. Because you have more and more companies wanting more and more space to get you all of your streaming video on your handheld devices. So the scarcity rationale is still a very important idea. The government must regulate this or it would be just a big train wreck. And the other one is the trustee rationale. Who owns the air over our heads? Does CBS, does Verizon own the air? No, we own the air. We the people own the air over our heads. We the people own the electromagnetic spectrum. So the idea is you, Verizon, or you, CBS, we're just entrusting the airwaves to you. We own it, but we're just letting you use it. You're a trustee. We are entrusting the airwaves to you. So you have to follow our rules. You don't own the airwaves. We own the airwaves. And we're just privileging you. We're doing you a favor in letting you use our airwaves. Therefore, you have to follow our rules.
Is the specification of over-air broadcast why like HBO and Showtime can, like they're allowed more leniency and stuff like that because it's,
What do you think?
I mean, do you pay for that channel? Or, because I mean.
And
Trump
so where do you
just
put it?
recently-
Where does HBO and Showtime, where do they fit?
I don't know.
Cable. And it is, so you see that it's treated, cable is treated different from over-the-air broadcast. It gets more First Amendment protection.
Does that include satellite radio now?
And we don't have a case for that proposition, but we assume that it's true. Satellite would be treated the same as cable. With cable, we actually have there are actually two cases, the Turner cases and the later, maybe you could Google that for me. Just look up the Turner cases, Turner 1 and Turner 2, and I want to say it's 1994, the last one.
1994 and 1997.
Okay, let's do 1997. So here, Turner is Ted Turner. Do y'all know who Ted Turner was? Who was Ted Turner? Yeah, TNT. It started out, Ted Turner was a television mogul down in Atlanta. And his first station was called TBS, the Superstation. And it was one of the first stations that, see, y'all, the way radio and television used to be a very local affair, right? You'd have a station like WGHB here in High Point that actually did a lot of programming. WRAL in Raleigh was very famous for doing children's programming and public affairs programming. You know, now the national companies have taken over, but it used to be very local. So he starts TBS, the Superstation, down in Atlanta, and he's one of the first television stations to go national, right? Other than the network, CBS, ABC, NBC. But it's a local station that goes national, challenges the dominance of the big networks. So he's very successful. The government at this point is regulating cable like this, with the lowest level of protection. And Turner and the cable operators want more freedom and leeway to do what they want to do, right? So for example, they want to have shows where they can say all the naughty words, like HBO and Showtime. So they go to court and they say, wait a minute, these rationales do not work. You cannot apply those rationales to cable. Why not? Why can't you make the same two arguments about cable companies? Because number one, they don't even use the airspace. Is cable scarce? No, we can just make more, right? We can just lay more cable. So the scarcity rationale, when you try to apply it to cable, really falls apart. And also, trustee, why doesn't the trustee rationale work with cable? Well, who owns the cable companies?
Or it's not us people, like private owners.
Right, they're private companies. We, the people, don't own the cable companies. The companies own the cable. So you can't say, like with the trustee rationale, we, the people, have lent you the cable. No, they own it. They paid for it. They laid it in the ground. Anybody ever seen a neighborhood when cable's being laid? I mean, back in those days, in the late 60s and early 70s, when the cable build-out started, I mean, can you imagine? Put your mind around this just a minute. If you're going to have to physically go out and dig a ditch and run a cable to every single house, it was a massive, massive, massive project. And the cable company spent a lot of money doing it, their money. Right? It's not like it was a government project that the taxpayers paid for. So the cable companies hammer on how the scarcity rationale doesn't work for cable, and they hammer on the fact that the trustee rationale does not work for cable. Therefore, they're saying, give us the highest level of protection and leave us alone. But the court doesn't want to do that. The government still wants room to regulate cable, so they have to come up with a different reason. I actually should use the correct term. Limited monopoly rationale. Just put your head around that in your own words. What do you think a limited monopoly is?
A limited monopoly, like they're monopolizing on the idea and the product, but limited because the government can put regulation on its control.
Okay, that's pretty good. Pretty good. Because, like for instance, when you moved to High Point and who lives off campus? Anybody? Only one person? So do you have an apartment? So do you have cable at your apartment? And so how many choices did you have to choose from in terms of the cable company? Which was what?
Somewhere in North State.
North State. What's that?
That's a reason to come here, High Point.
Okay. So, and that's unusual. It's unusual that you even had a choice. Most places you don't. I'm just curious. I'm going to Google it. Yeah, you usually don't have a choice. North State Communications. It's usually you just have Time Warner.
Down here?
In the old days, it was true everywhere. North State. That's interesting. Select services. Residential. Is it cable or is it DSL?
It's both. I think you can bundle it all together, just like Time Warner.
Yeah, because what they're probably doing, your television is probably actually coming over DSL. right? Because don't they offer you phone, cable TV, and internet? It's probably a DSL service, right? So in most towns, this is less true up north where you have population density. So in New York, you might have some choices, but in most towns, there is only one cable provider. You can get television in other ways. You can get it over DSL, you can get it over satellite, but as far as cable, a physical cable that comes to your house, it's usually just one. And it's usually Time Warner or, what's that one that everybody hates, Comcast? Yeah. So the idea is that those companies end up having a monopoly wherever they are. Because it would be impracticable for some other company to come into town. You know how we always want competition? If Time Warner has already spent a gazillion dollars to wire up an entire town, it would be very impractical for another company to come in and then lay all new cable. It's the same thing with like you get your power bill from Duke Energy, right? It's a monopoly because it would just be impractical for another huge company to come in and spend all that money again. But so just as here, where we said, look, you companies, we're doing you a favor by letting you use the airwaves, the limited monopoly rationale says, look, you cable companies, we're doing a favor by not suing you under the Sherman Antitrust Act. We're allowing you to have a monopoly because we know it would be very impractical for another company to build all these wires. And we know that you invested all that money, right? We appreciate the fact that you invested all that money. We're going to allow you to have a limited monopoly. You're going to get medium protection under the First Amendment. But because we're allowing you to have a monopoly in exchange, you have to let us regulate you some. So they do have, the cable companies do have to sit still for some regulation. It isn't all just, the Sopranos and the F word every other sentence, right? But that is exactly why. Like, no F word, yes F word. And then here you can have as many F words as you want. You can even have color photographs to go with it. So this is our first stair step that tells us, what we could say here, there were various rationales for these. The Burston case overturns the Mutual Film case, and so we could say, the court said, we made a mistake. That was a mistake back then, so we're just going to overturn that case. Of course, film and art is protected. With Reno versus ACLU, the main driver of that decision was protecting innovation. The internet was new. But think about the speed of the internet build-out. So Tim Berners-Lee and that crowd, they released the World Wide Web Protocol in 1992. The build-out, so we have the early adopters. Right? Young people would be early adopters. Have you ever seen a bell curve like this? So it's interesting. It's fun to know this history. So we have 1992. It's the fastest build-out of all. Every time a new technology comes, the build-out is faster. When you go back and just think of this, because we're all communication majors and this is part of our history, with the introduction or the development of photography and film in the late 19th century, 1895, the first motion picture in France done by the Lumiere brothers, 1895, and we don't get full sound motion pictures until 1929. Right, so it took a long time for the technology to develop. 1920, commercial radio begins, and it takes maybe about 10 years, because remember we had the fiasco with all the stations crossing each other, and then the 1927, the Radio Act of 1927. So let's say 10 years for the radio to build out. Then we had television. Television was experimental in the 20s, actually. But it had to sort of, sit through 2 world wars. before it finally took off, and it took off from starting in, let's say, 1947, after the war, and the build-out took about 10 years. Right. So by 1955, the majority of American homes had a television, so it's pretty fast. Then we get the internet. This is World Wide Web protocol comes along in 1992, and then really from 1995 to 2000 is all it takes for the build out, right? So we get the early adopters down here. And then we get the late adopters here. This is called diffusion theory, y'all. And then we get the laggards. This is the old people who don't know how to use the internet, right here. And so y'all younger people are early adopters. You were using, how old were y'all between 1995 and 2000?
Three.
Okay, so from 3 to 8 years old, you were probably already dipping a toe in the internet and seeing things, right? You were already playing games, and that's how usually people come into the internet, playing games. You know, but by the time you were in first grade, when were you in first grade? What year? 96. So late 90s, and probably by the time you were in, let's say, 5th or 6th grade, you probably started having computers in school, didn't you? Even in elementary school. This is another thing that's neat about it too. Back in, like when I was in high school, this would be in the late 70s and early 80s. If you ask people in a room who can type, who knows how to type, I don't mean hunt and peck, but actually type, only 2 or 3 people in this room would. What gender would they be? They'd be the only people who could type. In a high school, you'd have typing 1 and typing 2. Remember the classes? They'd be all young women. And they were the only people who took typing. They were the only people coming out of high school who knew how to type. If you ask a graduating class of any high school today, how many people type, what do you figure? Practically everyone. And the ones who didn't know how to touch type, at least they could hunt and peck very fast. You know, they could do the thumb thing that y'all do. But so it's really amazing how the technology builds out. And so see this, here's Reno v. ACLU right in here, right during the build out. And so everybody was really worried that the Supreme Court was going to give in to pressure.
It was like really early. You said 1995 earlier.
Yeah, 1995.
It was like right at the beginning of the build out.
Yeah, you're right. So the internet's really new, and people were really afraid that the Supreme Court, because you see a lot of First Amendment scholars think that all of this is a big mistake, right? If you're a First Amendment absolutist, you just say everything should get full force protection. So people were very worried, right? Because we had this brand new baby technology. And of course, the people who really believe in it, right? The techno-fabulists, as they're called, because they think the technology is fabulous. So the techno-fabulists are very worried that all the wonderful things that the internet is going to bring us is going to be squelched by government regulation. And of course, the porn people, like they want, the porn people always figure out how to make money first. So the porn people really want strong protection too. And so they get it with this case. And the main rationale is the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor wrote the decision. It's a really good decision. It's amazing. She was pretty hip. She got it. She understood the internet early on. But they were afraid that having too much regulation on the internet would hinder its development. So the Supreme Court decided to protect the internet. And the Tornillo rationale is that you can't go tell a newspaper or magazine what they can or cannot print, right? You can't control, the government can't take editorial control away from a publication. And so these are the reasons that they talk about to put that. Tornillo is an interesting case because it's about a politician who the newspaper ran an editorial or something that was very critical of him. And he came to the newspaper and says, you have to let me respond to this. You have to put my viewpoint in the paper. And the idea was called right of reply. The right of reply. And so the idea of right of reply goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court strikes down the whole idea as unconstitutional. You can't force a publication to print a viewpoint that it doesn't believe in, because you would be taking away editorial control. Another way of saying that is, you have no right to reply. The First Amendment protects a speaker. In other words, it's about compelled speech. It's like you can't force someone to say something that they don't want to say. Right? And so this case is also used in that way in subsequent cases. Tornillo also stands for the proposition against compelled speech. You see the case cited like that sometimes later on for that idea. How am I doing on time?
Like
3 minutes.
How many? 3 minutes? Okay, well, good. That's a good stopping point. And then on Wednesday, we will continue and we will do 3 more charts. on Wednesday. Thank you.